Before we jump into the story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. I never could have imagined that my life would take such an unexpected turn when I married Daniel. I thought it was the beginning of a beautiful new chapter, one filled with hope, love, and the joy of blending our families. Daniel's son, Liam, however, was a different story. Quiet, reserved, and somewhat distant, I initially chalked it up to the difficulties of adjusting to a new family dynamic. It must have been hard for him to see his father move on and bring someone new into their lives. After all, change is never easy, especially for a young adult. In the beginning, everything seemed to settle into a rhythm. Liam was polite, but there was always a certain distance between us. He had just turned 20, and although we didn't engage in deep conversations, I could sense that he was thoughtful, perhaps even introspective. Now and then, we would exchange pleasantries, but for the most part, he kept to himself, retreating to his room after the briefest interactions. I tried not to take it personally, believing that his behavior was merely a result of his age and the need for personal space, a need that I was more than happy to respect and give him. However, as time went on, I began to notice subtle things, small details that made me feel increasingly uneasy. It started innocently enough with the occasional glance I would catch out of the corner of my eye. Liam would look at me, his gaze lingering just a bit longer than what felt comfortable. At first, I dismissed it as nothing. Perhaps he was just adjusting to my presence in the house, learning the new boundaries of our relationship. After all, I was the new person in his life, and change takes time. But as the days passed, Liam's behavior began to grow more peculiar, almost unsettling. He started sitting closer to me on the couch when Daniel wasn't around. At first, it was only a little closer, but it began happening more frequently. His small talk, while polite, started carrying an undercurrent that I couldn't quite identify. It was as though he was saying things that didn't quite match the situation, things that made me feel uncomfortable, but I couldn't pinpoint why. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that he was just struggling with the change in our living arrangements and that his quiet nature was the result of his discomfort with the new family dynamic. Still, something felt off. One night, after a particularly long day at work, I came home completely drained. Daniel was away on a business trip, and the house felt eerily quiet. It was one of those nights where the silence was almost too much to bear. I made dinner for Liam and myself, and we shared a brief, somewhat awkward conversation about his plans for the weekend. He mentioned some late-night gaming sessions with his friends online, and once he finished eating, he quickly retreated to his room. I was exhausted and feeling under the weather, so I decided to call it a night early. I took a painkiller to help with the ache in my body, climbed into bed, and quickly fell into a deep sleep. The house was still, and for a moment, I allowed myself to feel safe and at ease in the quiet solitude. But that peace didn't last long. At some point in the night, I awoke, sensing something strange. It wasn't a loud noise or anything overt, but there was a presence in the room. I stirred, still groggy from both the medication I had taken and the deep sleep I had been in. I opened my eyes slowly, but the room was dark, silent, and still. And then I felt a soft touch on my arm. At first, I thought I might be dreaming. My mind was hazy, trying to piece together the reality of what was happening. I tried to sit up, but my body felt heavy, weighed down as if I was still trapped in a dream. Panic began to creep up my spine as I realized that someone was in the room with me. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I blinked rapidly, trying to shake off the fog from the sleep and the medication, but it didn't help. I struggled to focus, to figure out who was there. Then, in the faint light coming through the window, I saw him, Liam. His figure was standing at the foot of my bed, motionless, watching me. I could hardly believe my eyes. My heart pounded in my chest as I whispered his name in confusion and disbelief. Liam? I croaked, my voice hoarse from sleep. What are you doing? For a moment, there was no response. He just stood there, frozen, as if he was trying to decide how to explain himself. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Finally, Liam spoke, his voice soft but strained. You were You looked uncomfortable. I just wanted to make sure you were okay." His words felt out of place. They didn't match the situation at all. Here he was standing over me in the middle of the night, in my room, and his explanation didn't add up. I instinctively pulled the covers tighter around myself, trying to protect myself from the growing sense of unease. "Liam, it's late," I said softly, my voice trembling slightly despite my efforts to stay calm. "You should go back to your room." "I'm fine. I must have just been dreaming." He stood still for a moment longer, as though debating what to do next. Then, slowly, he nodded. Yeah, you're right. Sorry." He backed out of the room, closing the door gently behind him. I lay there, frozen in place for a few moments, trying to process what had just happened. My heart was still racing, my body was trembling, and my mind was a whirlwind of confusion. Was he truly concerned for me, or was there something more to it? I couldn't be sure, but I knew something didn't feel right. In the morning, when I saw Liam in the kitchen, he acted as if nothing had happened. He greeted me with a casual good morning and went about his day as if everything was normal. I wanted to believe that it was just a misunderstanding, a bizarre coincidence, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The way he had stood in my room, the way his gaze had lingered, his explanation, it all felt wrong. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was overreacting, that maybe I was just imagining things. Still, as the days went by, his behavior became more and more erratic. He would show up in places where he hadn't been before, lingering in the kitchen when I was cooking or standing just outside the living room as if waiting for something. And those glances, the way he watched me, became more frequent, more intense. There was something in his eyes, something I couldn't understand, that made me feel exposed and vulnerable. The more I tried to ignore it, the more the sense of unease grew. What had once felt like a small, harmless adjustment in our family dynamic was beginning to feel like a growing threat. And now I was left to wonder just how much of this I could ignore before it spiraled out of control. His words didn't quite match the situation. There was something wrong about him standing there in my room in the middle of the night. The intrusion felt unsettling, and yet I couldn't understand exactly why. I shifted in bed, instinctively pulling the covers tighter around myself, trying to put distance between us, even if only physically. My heart was racing, and I struggled to maintain my composure. I didn't want to jump to conclusions or overreact, but everything in me screamed that something wasn't right. "Liam, it's late," I said softly, trying to keep my voice steady despite the anxiety tightening in my chest. "You should go back to your room." "I'm fine. I must have just been dreaming." He hesitated, standing there for a moment longer than I was comfortable with, as though deciding whether or not to leave. Finally, he nodded slowly, almost reluctantly. "Yeah, you're right. Sorry." If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 1 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. The words didn't bring me relief. As he backed out of the room, closing the door behind him with a quiet click, I sat up, my mind racing. My body still felt tense, the weight of the situation pressing on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Was he genuinely just concerned about me? Or was there something more sinister lurking beneath his words and actions? My mind couldn't make sense of it, and I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, a simple misunderstanding perhaps. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The following morning, I tried to brush it off, telling myself that I was overthinking the whole thing. When I saw Liam in the kitchen, he acted as though nothing had happened. His greeting was casual, as if he had just woken up and the night before had been nothing more than an ordinary, uneventful evening. I wanted to believe that I had imagined the entire thing, that I was just too tired or perhaps reading too much into something harmless. But as the day went on, the unsettling feeling refused to fade. Liam's behavior started to change. At first, it was subtle, little things that I couldn't quite place. He would hang around in places he hadn't before, lingering in the kitchen when I was cooking, standing in the hallway outside the living room when I was reading. It seemed as though he was always there, just close enough to be noticed, but not quite close enough to make me feel comfortable. And then, there were the looks. The lingering stares made my skin crawl, as though he was studying me in a way that felt far too intense for someone I was supposed to be getting to know as a part of my new family. I tried to brush it all off, thinking that maybe I was just being too sensitive, or maybe Liam was simply having trouble adjusting to the changes in his life. I didn't want to cause any unnecessary tension between him and Daniel, and I wasn't even sure that my concerns were valid. Perhaps I was imagining things, and his behavior was just an odd phase he was going through. But as the days went by, the discomfort only grew, and I found myself avoiding being alone with Liam whenever possible. One evening, Daniel returned from his business trip, and for a brief moment, I thought about telling him everything that had happened. The way Liam had acted in the middle of the night, the strange behavior I had been noticing. But something held me back. I didn't want to create tension between father and son, especially when I wasn't even sure I could explain what was bothering me. I wasn't certain that what I felt was real or just a figment of my imagination. However, the sense of unease continued to grow. That night, after Daniel had gone to bed early with a headache, Liam and I were left alone in the living room. I tried to distract myself with a book, my eyes scanning the pages while Liam played a video game across the room. For a while, we both stayed in our separate worlds, but eventually, Liam put down the controller and, without a word, moved closer to where I was sitting. I could feel the tension in the air, thickening by the second, as my body involuntarily tensed. He sat down next to me, his leg brushing against mine. The contact was light, but it felt too intimate, too personal. And then his eyes, those intense, searching eyes, turned to me. It was as if he was studying my every movement, trying to read something in me that I couldn't even understand myself. "You're really beautiful, you know that?" His voice was low and unfamiliar, and the weight of his words hung in the air between us. I froze, my mind racing for something to say, anything to break the uncomfortable silence. There was something about the way he said it, the tone in his voice, that made my stomach turn. His words carried a weight that I wasn't ready to confront, and my pulse quickened as I tried to figure out how to respond. I laughed nervously, forcing a small, uncomfortable sound to escape my throat, hoping to downplay the moment. "Thank you, Liam," I muttered, my eyes drifting to the book in my lap, though the words on the page were now a blur. "That's sweet, but you know it's late. We should probably get some rest." But Liam didn't move. His gaze remained fixed on me, his eyes unwavering, and I could feel the tension building, thick and suffocating in the air. It was as if there was something magnetic about his stare, something that drew me in despite my discomfort. I shifted in my seat, subtly trying to create more space between us, but the energy between us refused to dissipate. "You're always so distant," he said, his tone soft, almost vulnerable. "I don't know why we could get along better if you didn't keep pushing me away." I was taken aback. Liam had always been the one to keep his distance, not me. He had always been the one to withdraw, to keep his emotions to himself. But now, here he was speaking as though there was some deeper connection between us that I had never recognized, and it unsettled me deeply. "Liam, I'm not pushing you away," I said, my voice gentle but firm, trying to remain calm despite the knot tightening in my stomach. "I care about you. We're still figuring out our relationship, you know? It takes time to get used to new family dynamics." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "It doesn't have to be complicated. I know you feel something too. I've seen the way you look at me." A chill ran down my spine. The words he spoke were like a slap to the face, shattering the illusion that this was just a misunderstanding. The way he looked at me, the things he said, they felt wrong, twisted, as though he had misinterpreted everything. Had I unknowingly led him to believe something that wasn't true? Or was this all in his mind, a delusion that he couldn't or wouldn't let go of? The air in the room grew thick with tension, and I realized with a sinking feeling that this wasn't just some innocent mistake. This wasn't just a miscommunication or an awkward phase. This was something darker, something more dangerous, and I wasn't sure what to do about it. "A misunderstanding? Is that what you're going to say?" Liam's voice dropped lower, a dangerous edge creeping in. "Because I know what I felt. I know you felt it too. You can lie to yourself all you want, but I won't forget." I stood up abruptly, my heart pounding in my chest. A wave of panic rushed over me, and I could feel my body trembling from the intensity of the conversation. His words, his behavior. They were becoming unbearable. "This conversation is over, Liam," I said, my voice firm despite the fear that had begun to creep into my veins. "You need to stop this now. You're crossing a line, and you don't seem to understand that. Whatever you're thinking, it's not right. This is not okay." Liam remained seated, but his eyes never left me. There was a sense of finality in his gaze, a glimmer of something I couldn't name, but that made my stomach churn. "You're making this more complicated than it has to be," he said, his tone low, but filled with a kind of quiet menace. "Dad doesn't need to know anything. We can keep this between us. Why are you acting like this? We both know there's something more here." I could feel the weight of his words crushing me. The pressure in my chest grew unbearable, and I had to remind myself to breathe, to stand firm, even though every part of me wanted to run away from the conversation. I had hoped for so long that this was just a phase, that I was overreacting. But now, standing there, it was clear. Liam was making this worse, crossing boundaries I couldn't ignore. "Liam, stop," I said, my voice cracking with emotion. "You need to leave. This is inappropriate, and I don't know where this is coming from, but it's not okay. You're my stepson. We are family. I care about you, but this is wrong." For a brief moment, he looked at me as if I had slapped him. His face fell, momentarily clouded with a mixture of disappointment and frustration, and it almost broke me to see him like that. But as he turned to leave, his words cut through the silence. "Fine," he muttered, his voice thick with bitterness. "But you'll regret it." The door slammed behind him, and I felt like the entire world had shifted, leaving me standing in the center of a storm I couldn't control. The air felt suffocating, and the tension that had been building for days now weighed heavily on my chest. I sank back into the couch, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. What had just happened? How had everything spiraled so quickly? Was this happening? I thought about telling Daniel. I knew I should. The truth was eating me up inside. But the fear of destroying their relationship, of breaking the family apart, kept me paralyzed. If I told Daniel, everything would change. But if I kept quiet, I would be complicit in something that felt so wrong. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 2 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Days passed, and the distance between Liam and me grew. He barely acknowledged my presence, and when he did, his eyes were filled with anger, resentment, and something else I couldn't identify. He spent most of his time holed up in his room or out of the house entirely. Daniel, completely unaware of the undercurrent of tension, chalked it up to typical young adult behavior. But I knew better. The silent weight of what had happened between Liam and me loomed over every interaction, every glance. I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't ignore what had happened. And yet, every time I considered telling Daniel, the fear of destroying everything I had worked so hard to build, of breaking the fragile peace in our home, stopped me. But I couldn't bear the thought of continuing this way. I knew I had to make a decision. One evening, Daniel suggested a family dinner, a chance for us to reconnect after the stress of the past week. "We've barely spent any time together lately," he said with a smile, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. "I think it's time for a little bonding, don't you?" I forced a smile, trying to hide the nervous energy coursing through my body. The weight of everything that had happened hung heavily on me. Liam sat across the table, his face an unreadable mask, barely acknowledging my presence as he pushed his food around. The silence was suffocating, and I could feel the tension between us crackling like electricity. Halfway through the meal, Daniel excused himself to take a phone call from work, and the moment he left the room, Liam's demeanor shifted. He leaned forward, his voice cold and low, sending a chill through my spine. "You haven't told him, have you?" His words cut through the silence like a knife. I looked up, startled by the sudden harshness in his voice. The vulnerability I had once seen in him, the boyish uncertainty, was gone. In its place was something far more unsettling. His eyes were dark and unreadable, and there was a determined, almost dangerous glint in them. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice shaking, trying to maintain control despite the rising panic in my chest. He leaned in even closer, his gaze piercing through me. You know exactly what I'm talking about. What happened between us? You haven't told Dad. You're scared. My heart dropped into my stomach. The words were too much to bear. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him to stop, but instead, I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. Nothing happened between us, Liam, I said, my voice tight with fear and frustration. You need to stop this. It was a misunderstanding, and you're taking it too far. His eyes narrowed, and he didn't back down. A misunderstanding? He repeated, his voice dangerously low. Is that what you're going to call it? Because I know what I felt, and I know you felt it too. You can lie to yourself all you want, but I won't forget. My whole body felt like it was on fire as the walls of the room seemed to close in around me. I was trapped in this conversation, and there was no escape. Every part of me screamed that this had to end, but I didn't know how to make it stop. Liam, this needs to stop, I said, my voice trembling with the weight of the moment. This is not just a misunderstanding. You're crossing boundaries that can never be crossed. I am your father's wife, and you need to respect that. There is no place for whatever you're suggesting. This is not okay. For a moment, Liam looked like I had punched him. His face clouded over with a mix of confusion and anger. But before he could say another word, he turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. I stood there, shaking, trying to process the overwhelming emotions swirling in my mind. What had just happened? What had I just been forced to confront? The encounter left me feeling small, helpless, and unsure of what would come next. I sat back down, my mind spinning, torn between telling Daniel and keeping this all hidden. But no matter what I chose, one thing was clear. Things between Liam and me had irrevocably changed, and there was no going back. I'll talk to him, Daniel said finally, his voice quiet and strained. This isn't something we can ignore. I nodded, feeling a small sense of relief mixed with an overwhelming sorrow. I had just unloaded a burden that had been eating away at me for days, but I knew that things were far from over. The path forward felt uncertain, and I couldn't help but wonder how our family, and especially Daniel, would handle this. That evening, after Daniel confronted Liam, I stayed in the bedroom, hoping that the conversation would lead to some resolution, yet dreading what might come of it. The silence that followed felt unbearable, and I could hear faint murmurs of voices from the other room. Daniel was speaking firmly, but I could hear the frustration and the hurt in his tone. Liam, on the other hand, was defensive, his voice rising at times, then falling into mutters. The minutes stretched into hours, and I felt like I was waiting for the inevitable storm to hit. I knew that once everything was out in the open, nothing would ever be the same again. Finally, Daniel entered the room. He looked exhausted and emotionally drained, and his eyes were red-rimmed as if he had been fighting back tears. The sight of him hurt my heart, knowing that he was carrying the weight of everything I had just told him. He's going to stay with his mother for a while, Daniel said softly, his voice hollow. We need some space. He needs help sorting through his feelings. I nodded, relief mingling with a deep ache. I had hoped for this resolution, but knowing that Liam would be leaving the house, even temporarily, felt like a final chapter closing. The damage had been done, and there was no going back. As much as I loved Daniel, I couldn't help but wonder what this would mean for us, whether we could ever fully rebuild the trust that had been shaken. I'm sorry you had to go through this, Daniel added, his voice shaking slightly. I wish I had known sooner. I should have seen the signs. It's not your fault, I replied quickly, my voice thick with emotion. You didn't know. I didn't want to hurt you. I just didn't know how to bring it up or how to explain what was happening. I wanted to protect our family. To protect you. He reached for my hand, and though there was sadness in his touch, there was also understanding. He knew that, like him, I had been navigating this new and painful reality the best way I knew how. But now, the truth was out, and as difficult as it was, we had to face the consequences of those actions. I'm just glad you told me, Daniel said, his voice raw. I'll talk to Liam. We'll figure this out. We'll work through it together. I squeezed his hand, grateful for his willingness to fight for our family, but the weight of everything still hung heavy in the air. I knew that the days ahead would be filled with difficult conversations and difficult choices, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like we were on the same team again. even if we didn't have all the answers. In the quiet that followed, I couldn't help but feel that everything had changed irrevocably. Our family, our lives, they were never going to be the same. But what mattered now was how we moved forward, how we chose to heal, and how we chose to rebuild what had been broken. And despite everything, I still held on to the hope that, with time, we could find our way back to something that resembled peace. I'll talk to him. This isn't something we can ignore. Those words echoed in my mind as the evening wore on. When Daniel confronted Liam, I stayed in the bedroom, not wanting to be a part of the fallout. My heart was already heavy with the weight of what had happened, and I knew I couldn't handle witnessing the raw emotion that would inevitably follow. I could hear their voices, Daniel's tone stern and controlled, while Liam's came through defensive and angry. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. My mind raced, replaying every word I had said to Daniel, every moment that had led to this point. I felt as if I were waiting for some kind of resolution, but I didn't know what that would look like or if it would even be enough. When Daniel finally entered the bedroom, his face was worn and tired, as though the weight of what had just transpired had drained the life out of him. The sight of him, broken and exhausted, hit me harder than I had expected. It wasn't just his pain that hurt, but the realization that everything, our family, our relationship, had been irrevocably changed. He's going to stay with his mother for a while, Daniel said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. We need some space, and he needs help sorting through his feelings. I nodded, a sense of relief washing over me, but it was mingled with a deep, painful sadness. The immediate danger had passed, but I knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. There was no undoing the damage that had been done. Things would never be the same between us. The boundaries Liam had blurred, the trust that had been shattered. Those would take time to heal if they ever could. But for now, I was grateful for the distance, for the temporary break that would allow us both to breathe. I knew that in time, the scars would remain, but the healing had to begin. And though the future seemed uncertain, I had to hold on to the hope that somehow we could rebuild one step at a time. Thank you for watching. Now that you've heard this powerful story, what have you learned so far? Take a moment to reflect on the emotions, boundaries, and important lessons shared throughout this video. What's one thing you've learned that you'll bring into your own life or relationships? Please comment below with your thoughts and insights. We'd love to hear what stood out to you the most. If you like this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more thought-provoking content like this. Stay connected, and let's continue learning together.